John Williams was an ordinary man, not famous or wealthy, but he had something that made him stand out: his unwavering love for his daughter, Emily. John had always worked hard. He was a skilled poker player, known among his small circle of friends for his ability to read people and make risky moves that often paid off. But there was more to his life than poker. Emily, at just 15, was the most important thing in his world. He worked extra hours to give her the best education, hoping she would have a future far brighter than his own. For years, John had dreamed of competing in the intergalactic poker tournament. It wasn't just any poker tournament. It was the biggest, the most prestigious event in the galaxy, where the best players from countless species came together to compete. The prize was life-changing, and the opportunity to win had always seemed out of reach. Yet John had saved for years, working every job he could find, to finally earn the entry fee. One night, after finishing another long shift at his part-time job, John sat in his living room, staring at the invitation to the tournament in his hands. The letter was more than just a ticket to the game. It was his hope for a future where Emily could go to the best schools, where she would have everything he never had. It was a future he'd worked his whole life for. "Dad, you ready for the tournament?" Emily asked, walking into the room with a smile. John smiled back, hiding the nervousness in his chest. "I'm ready. But no matter what happens, we're in this together, okay?" Emily nodded. "I know you'll do great. You've got this." Her words gave him strength. John wasn't just playing for money. He was playing for his daughter's future. The day of the tournament arrived, and John couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and dread. The event was being held on a massive space station in the heart of the galaxy, and people from all over the universe were gathering. As John walked into the grand hall, he saw aliens of all shapes and sizes, some towering over him, others with strange features he couldn't even begin to understand. But it wasn't their appearance that worried him. It was the skill they brought to the table. He knew that for every skilled player in the room, there were countless others who had trained their entire lives for this moment. As the tournament began, John tried to focus on his cards. He was a good player, but even he knew that luck played a big role. His first few rounds went smoothly. He wasn't winning big, but he was holding his own, carefully watching the other players, picking up on their tells. His confidence grew as he won a few rounds and advanced to the final table. But then, just as John thought he was starting to get a handle on the game, everything changed. A voice echoed across the hall, commanding attention. "I propose a challenge," it said. The voice was deep, almost like it came from the very air itself, and it was unlike anything John had ever heard. The crowd parted as a figure stepped into the center of the room. He was an alien, tall and imposing, with a sleek, dark blue skin that shimmered under the lights. His eyes were a striking silver, and his movements were smooth, almost predatory. He walked with the confidence of someone who knew he could have anything he wanted, and it was clear he did not fear anyone in the room. "Who dares accept my challenge?" he asked, his voice ringing with authority. The entire hall fell silent. Even the most confident players shrank back, intimidated by the alien's presence. John stood frozen, unsure of what to do. The alien's gaze swept across the room, his eyes stopping when they landed on John. "Ah, a human," the alien said, his tone amused. "I see you're playing well, but you're nothing special. I challenge you to a game. If you win, I'll let you keep your place in the tournament. But if I win, I take something from you." John's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean, take something from me?" he asked, trying to steady his voice. The alien smirked. "Simple. I'll take your daughter. If I win, she comes with me, and you'll never see her again. If you win, you get to keep her, and I'll be gone." A shock ran through John's body. He looked around, seeing the stunned faces of the other players. Some of them looked afraid. Others seemed curious, as though they wanted to see how this would unfold. But John's mind was spinning. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. This alien, this Khazar, was willing to gamble his daughter's future in exchange for a game of poker. "Are you out of your mind?" John blurted. "You can't do that. I'm not some fool who'll risk my daughter's life for a game." Khazar raised an eyebrow. "You have no choice. Either you accept, or I will ruin your life. And you will regret it. You've worked your whole life for this moment, haven't you? Now you must prove that you deserve it." John felt the pressure of the moment. He couldn't back down now, not with Emily's future at stake. The thought of losing her, of giving her up to this cold, calculating alien, made his stomach turn. But the stakes were too high. He couldn't afford to lose. "I'll do it," John said, his voice barely above a whisper. The words felt heavy on his tongue, but he knew there was no other choice. "I'll accept your challenge." Khazar's eyes gleamed, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "Good. Let's see if a human can really stand up to me. Prepare yourself, John Williams. This will be a game you'll never forget." And so, the game began. The room was tense. John's hands trembled slightly as he shuffled the cards in his hands, trying to keep his mind focused. He could feel the weight of the entire universe on his shoulders. He had never felt so much pressure in his life. He wasn't just playing for money, nor was he playing just for himself. This time, it was for Emily. Across from him, the alien Khazar sat confidently, his sharp eyes watching every move John made. There was something unsettling about the way Khazar moved, smooth, deliberate, and cold. John couldn't help but feel like he was being watched by a predator, one who could pounce at any moment. The table was quiet, save for the sound of the cards being dealt. The other players had backed away, their faces a mixture of fear and curiosity. None of them seemed willing to challenge Khazar. After all, the alien had the reputation of being unbeatable, and his eyes told John that he wasn't exaggerating. John adjusted his seat, trying to control his breathing. He had been in tough situations before, but this was different. This wasn't just a game. It was a battle for his daughter's future. Every decision he made could bring him closer to victory, or closer to losing everything. The cards were dealt, and John focused on his hand. He had a decent starting hand, not the best, but not the worst either. He had been in enough games to know that luck played its part, but skill and strategy were what truly made the difference. Khazar didn't speak, but his silence was just as menacing as any taunt. John could feel his gaze, as though Khazar was reading his every move. John's mind raced. What was the alien planning? What was his strategy? He couldn't afford to make any mistakes. Khazar had a reputation for winning by exploiting his opponent's weaknesses, and John had no intention of letting that happen. The first few rounds passed in silence. John played carefully, only making small bets, trying to get a feel for Khazar's style. The alien didn't react much, but John could tell that he was watching him closely. Every small movement, every change in expression, was being analyzed. Khazar was an expert at the game, but John wasn't about to back down. He had faced challenges before and always found a way to fight back. The third round began, and John was dealt a pair of aces. His heart raced, but he kept his cool. This was a hand he could work with. He pushed the chips forward with steady hands, making a moderate bet. Khazar raised him, his silver eyes gleaming with confidence. "I see you have a strong hand, human," Khazar said, his voice cold and calculating. "But will it be enough to face me?" John didn't flinch. "We'll see," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. As the next card was dealt, John's eyes narrowed. A king. That was good. He now had a pair of aces and a king on the board. It wasn't a sure win, but it was enough to keep him in the game. He decided to raise again, pushing his chips forward. Khazar mirrored his movements, showing no sign of worry. The tension in the room grew thicker with each round. The audience had gathered around, watching in silence. Even the other competitors had their eyes glued to the table. They knew how important this game was. Khazar was not just any player. He was known as the unbeatable champion of the galaxy. For a human like John to challenge him was unheard of. But John wasn't just any human. As the final card was dealt, John felt his heart pound in his chest. He had nothing left to lose. The board showed a full house for Khazar. 3 kings and 2 tens. John's stomach sank as he looked at his own hand. He had a pair of aces and another ace in the community cards. It was a good hand, but not enough to beat Khazar's full house. Khazar looked at him, his silver eyes glinting with satisfaction. "It seems you've lost, human," he said, a mocking tone in his voice. John's heart dropped. It was over. He had lost. Emily would be taken from him, and there was nothing he could do. The thought of losing her made his chest tighten. He looked up at Khazar, ready to accept his fate. But something inside him stirred, something he hadn't felt before. A surge of determination, a fire that burned hotter than any fear he had ever known. He couldn't lose. Not like this. Not when Emily's future was on the line. John took a deep breath, his mind racing. "I raise," he said, pushing all of his remaining chips into the middle of the table. Khazar paused, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. "You dare challenge me again?" "I do," John said firmly, meeting Khazar's gaze without flinching. "I'm not going to back down. Not now." For a long moment, Khazar said nothing. His expression was unreadable, but John could tell that he was considering his options. Finally, the alien raised an eyebrow and called. With a steady hand, John revealed his cards. He had a 3 of a kind, 3 aces. It wasn't a full house, but it was enough to win. Khazar's expression faltered, just for a moment. He had lost. The room went silent. John leaned back in his chair, his breath heavy, his heart still racing. He had done it. He had won. Khazar's smug confidence was shattered. For the first time, the alien seemed vulnerable. But this was just the beginning. The real test was still ahead. John had won the round. But the true battle for Emily's future had only just begun. John sat back in his chair, staring across the table at Khazar, who had just lost the round. The alien's usual smugness had disappeared, replaced by a rare flicker of uncertainty. The crowd around the table buzzed with excitement, whispers filling the air. No one had expected a human, especially one like John, to stand a chance against Khazar, the galaxy's most feared poker player. But John had done it. He had beaten Khazar in the first round. His hands were still trembling, but his mind was focused. There was no time to relax. He had one more round to win before he could truly say he had secured Emily's future. Khazar leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he studied John. The silence between them was thick, charged with tension. John had won this round, but Khazar was not the type to give up easily. "You think you can win this easily, human?" Khazar's voice was low and menacing. "You've beaten me once, but I don't lose twice. You may have won a hand, but this is far from over." John didn't respond. He knew Khazar's words were meant to intimidate him, to make him doubt his ability. But John had something more important driving him than fear. He had Emily to think about. He couldn't afford to let his guard down. The dealer began to shuffle the cards for the next round. The air was thick with anticipation. John's eyes flicked over to Emily, who was sitting off to the side, her face pale with worry. He gave her a small smile, trying to reassure her, though his own heart was racing. He couldn't let her see how terrified he was. Not now. The cards were dealt, and John's fingers brushed over the deck, trying to read the situation. The stakes were higher now. This wasn't just a poker game. It was a battle for his daughter's safety, a test of everything he had worked for. He had to keep his emotions in check. Khazar studied his cards for a moment, then placed his bet with a confident gesture. His eyes locked onto John's, as if daring him to respond. John took a deep breath and followed suit, matching the bet. He knew this was only the beginning. As the round progressed, John kept his cool. The cards were dealt, one by one, and the tension in the room grew thicker. Khazar was good, very good. He made every move with calculated precision, reading John's every move, waiting for any sign of weakness. But John wasn't about to let himself slip. The first 3 community cards were placed face up in the center of the table. John looked at the cards with a mix of hope and caution. A 10, a 3, and a queen. His hand wasn't the best, but it wasn't the worst either. He had a pair of jacks in his hand, and that could work in his favor if the right cards came up. Khazar's eyes flicked over the board, his expression unreadable. He placed another bet, this time doubling his previous wager. The move was aggressive, but it didn't shake John. He had faced tougher situations before. John leaned forward, his gaze fixed on the cards. The next community card was revealed. A 5. It didn't help John much, but it didn't hurt either. His pair of jacks was still in play, and he was going to hold on to that. Khazar raised the bet again, his silver eyes gleaming. "You think you can beat me again?" he asked, his voice cold. "You've gotten lucky once, but luck won't save you forever." John didn't flinch. "We'll see about that," he said, matching the bet once more. The final card was dealt, and the tension in the room reached a breaking point. John's eyes widened as the last card, a king, was revealed. He now had a pair of jacks and a king. It wasn't a great hand, but it was enough to put up a good fight. Khazar, however, had a full house. His cards were a pair of kings and 3 queens. John knew he had to be careful. The alien had the upper hand, but he wasn't going to give up without a fight. Khazar raised his bet again, this time placing all his chips on the table. It was an all-in move, one that signaled he was confident in his win. John felt his heart race. If he called, he could either win everything or lose it all. Emily's face flashed in his mind. He couldn't lose. Not now. He couldn't let her down. John took a deep breath and pushed all of his chips into the center of the table. "I called," he said, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. Khazar smirked. "You're brave, human, but bravery won't save you." John nodded, meeting the alien's gaze with determination. "We'll see." The dealer flipped over their cards. Khazar had won again. The alien's smug expression returned as he looked down at his full house, but something shifted in John. There was no time for regret. He couldn't afford to lose his nerve now. Khazar had won the hand, but the game was far from over. John still had one more chance. The audience watched with bated breath as John's expression remained calm, his eyes focused. He didn't let the loss shake him. He had seen enough to know that Khazar wasn't invincible. The alien had shown signs of vulnerability, and John was determined to exploit it. He stood up, his legs steady as he made his way to Emily, who was sitting with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked up at him with wide eyes, worried but hopeful. John smiled at her, taking her hand in his. "This isn't over, Emily," he whispered. "We're not done yet." She nodded, squeezing his hand. "I know, Dad. You'll win." And with that, John returned to the table, his resolve stronger than ever. Khazar had won the battle, but John was prepared to fight for his daughter until the very end. John sat across the table from Khazar, the weight of the previous loss still pressing on his chest. The alien had outplayed him again, but something in the back of his mind told him that it wasn't over. He had learned something important about Khazar. The alien could be beaten, but it would take more than just luck. As the dealer shuffled the cards for the next round, John took a deep breath. He needed to stay calm. The stakes were higher than ever. Emily's future, his daughter's safety, depended on him. There was no room for mistakes. He couldn't afford another loss. Khazar's silver eyes gleamed, and for a moment, John saw a flicker of respect in them. It wasn't much, but it was enough to let him know that Khazar recognized the human's determination. "I must admit," Khazar said in his deep, cold voice, "you've done better than I expected. But don't get too confident. You're still playing in my world, human." John didn't respond. He wasn't here to talk. He was here to win. The cards were dealt, and as the first few fell in front of him, he felt a spark of hope. The hand wasn't great, but it was better than the last one. The crowd around them watched in silence, waiting for the next move. The poker table was surrounded by spectators, most of them aliens from different parts of the galaxy, all eager to see who would come out on top. John's hands felt clammy, but he forced himself to focus. He couldn't let fear control them now. He had to think clearly. The first community card was dealt. A queen. It wasn't a strong card, but it could still help him. Khazar placed his first bet. A small one. John hesitated for a second, trying to gauge whether the alien was bluffing. He had seen Khazar play enough to know that he didn't take chances unless he was confident. After a moment's pause, John decided to call. The game was about calculated risks. He couldn't back down now, not when everything was on the line. The second community card was placed. It was a 7. Not much use for John, but it wasn't a disaster either. His hand was still just a pair of jacks. He looked over at Emily, who was sitting in the corner of the room, her eyes filled with concern. He gave her a small smile, hoping to reassure her, but inside, he was shaking. Khazar, however, was unfazed. He raised the bet, his silver eyes watching John closely, waiting for him to react. John's mind raced. The alien was playing his usual game of intimidation. But this time, John had a plan. He wasn't going to play it safe. He needed to take risks if he wanted to win. "I call," John said, his voice steady despite the storm of thoughts in his mind. The third community card was revealed. An ace. John's heart skipped a beat. That was the card he needed. He now had a pair of jacks and an ace. The hand was stronger than it had been, but Khazar could still be holding something better. He needed to be careful. Khazar looked down at his cards, then back at John. The silence stretched between them like a thick rope, taut and waiting to snap. "You're playing well, human," Khazar said slowly. "But are you ready to risk it all?" John's pulse quickened, but he didn't let it show. Khazar was trying to get into his head, just like last time. But John wasn't going to fall for it. He had learned a lot from the last round. He wasn't just playing cards. He was playing Khazar himself. "I'll take my chances," John replied, pushing his chips forward. The crowd murmured, intrigued by John's bold move. Khazar's lips curled into a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. He was still trying to read John, trying to figure out if the human was bluffing. The final community card was dealt. John held his breath. It was a 4. The board now had a queen, 7, ace, and 4. John's pair of jacks wasn't enough. But he wasn't giving up. He had the ace, and that could still turn the game in his favor. Khazar placed another bet, this one significantly higher than the last. John's mind was racing. Could Khazar be bluffing again? Or was he really that confident? John's gut told him that this was the moment. He glanced at Emily again, her face full of concern but also trust. She believed in him. "I call," John said, his voice calm despite the storm inside his chest. Khazar leaned back in his chair, a glint of amusement in his eyes. "You call with that hand?" he asked, his voice a mix of mockery and admiration. "You're brave, I'll give you that." John didn't respond. He had made his move. Now all he could do was wait. The cards were revealed. Khazar had a full house, a pair of aces, and 3 queens. It was a powerful hand, one that seemed unbeatable. John's heart sank for a moment, but he didn't give up. Then the dealer flipped over John's hand. It was a straight, 7, 8, 9, 10, and jack. A perfect run. The room fell silent as the realization spread across the table. John had won. Against all odds, he had beaten Khazar with a hand that no one had expected. Khazar's jaw tightened as he looked at the cards in front of him, then back at John. There was no smugness in his eyes now, just the cold, hard reality that the human had outplayed him. John leaned back in his chair, his hands still trembling, but a smile tugged at his lips. He had done it. He had won. Emily's future was safe. He looked over at her, and she was already standing, rushing to him with tears in her eyes. "You did it, Dad," she exclaimed, her voice filled with relief and joy. John hugged her tightly, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. He had kept his promise. He had won. And Khazar, he was just another opponent in the game. John had shown him that humans could fight and win, even against the odds. The crowd was still silent, absorbing the shock of the game's outcome. John leaned back in his chair, his hands trembling, but a victorious smile stretched across his face. He had won, against all odds, against Khazar, the alien who had outplayed him again and again. His heart was pounding, but it was no longer from fear. This time, it was from the rush of victory. Emily was already at his side, her face lit up with joy. She had witnessed the entire game, the tension, the doubt, and the final triumph. She couldn't hold back her emotions any longer. She threw her arms around him, hugging him tightly. "Dad, you did it," she exclaimed, her voice cracking with happiness. John wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. For a moment, everything felt perfect. They had done it. They were free. But as the cheers from the crowd began to fade, a sense of unease crept over John. Khazar was standing at the end of the table, his silver eyes burning with an unreadable expression. The alien didn't move. He didn't speak. It was almost as if he was frozen in place, processing the loss. John's mind raced. He had won. But what did that mean for Khazar? What would the alien do now? He had seen how Khazar played the game, how the alien's pride was just as sharp as his intellect. Would Khazar honor the bet, or would he seek revenge? The silence stretched on, and John felt the weight of the situation settle over him once again. He couldn't afford to relax just yet, not until they were truly safe. Khazar finally broke the silence, his voice cold and calculated. "You've won," he said slowly, as if each word was a painful admission. "And I will honor the bet. But know this, human." He paused, his gaze never leaving John. "You may have won this game, but the universe doesn't work on your terms. There are consequences." John's heart skipped a beat. What was Khazar trying to say? Hadn't he won the right to his daughter's freedom? Why was the alien speaking like this? Khazar continued, his voice colder now. "You are lucky to have survived this long. But remember, human, power shifts like the wind. Today, you've won. But tomorrow..." John straightened in his seat, no longer afraid. Khazar might be a formidable opponent, but John wasn't about to back down. He had fought for his daughter's safety, and he wasn't about to let this alien intimidate him now. "Tomorrow doesn't matter," John said firmly, his voice steady. "Today I've won, and you've lost. I'm taking Emily home, and you will not interfere." Khazar's lips twisted into something like a smile, but there was no warmth in it. "We'll see," he muttered, before turning and walking away from the table. John's muscles relaxed just a little as Khazar disappeared into the crowd. He had won the bet. Emily was safe, but something still gnawed at the back of his mind. Khazar's words hung in the air, a reminder that this victory, like all victories, had a price. As John and Emily began to make their way toward the exit, he felt a strange sense of uncertainty creeping in. They had made it through this challenge, but what else awaited them? What did Khazar mean by consequences? Was this truly over, or was it just the beginning of something much more dangerous? The thoughts swirled in John's mind, but he pushed them aside for now. Emily was his priority. She had gone through so much already, and she deserved to feel safe. They stepped out into the cool night air. The streets of the alien city were quieter now, the chaos of the tournament fading behind them. For the first time in what felt like forever, John allowed himself to relax. "We did it," Emily said, her voice filled with disbelief. "We're freed, Dad." John smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "Yeah, we did it. We're free." But even as the words left his mouth, the feeling of victory didn't sit quite right. There was something unfinished about it, something lingering in the back of his mind. The alien world they had just escaped was vast, full of dangers John didn't fully understand. They walked together through the quiet streets, the neon lights of the alien city casting strange shadows around them. Despite everything they had been through, John couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The events of the tournament had drawn a lot of attention, and he had no idea how far Khazar's reach extended. "Dad, do you think everything's really over?" Emily asked, her voice soft. John paused for a moment, looking down at her. He had always tried to protect her, to shield her from the harshness of the world. But this was a world unlike anything he had ever known. And even though they had won, even though they had made it out alive, he couldn't guarantee their safety. "I don't know, sweetheart," he said honestly, ruffling her hair. "But I do know one thing. As long as I'm here, I'll keep you safe." Emily smiled, and for a brief moment, everything felt right again. But John knew that the road ahead was still uncertain. Khazar's threat still lingered, and the universe was a vast and unpredictable place. The only thing John could do now was move forward, one step at a time, because no matter what came next, he wasn't going to let anyone take his daughter from him. Not now. Not ever. John and Emily walked further into the alien city, the strange architecture towering over them. The streets were still alive with activity, but it felt different now. The air was tense, heavy with unspoken threats. John couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. His instincts were on high alert. Emily, walking beside him, seemed oblivious to the growing unease. She had her head turned upward, taking in the incredible sights of the alien city, her eyes wide with wonder. But John knew better. This place was not as safe as it seemed. It had never been. His thoughts kept returning to Khazar's words, words that didn't sit right. "You may have won this game, but the universe doesn't work on your terms. There are consequences." John didn't fully understand what Khazar meant, but he could feel it in his bones. The alien had played a long game, and he wasn't someone who took defeat lightly. John had been through too much in his life to believe that everything was over just because they had won a bet. He glanced over at Emily, who was still lost in the beauty of the alien world around them. She was finally free, and that was all that mattered to him. But something told him that Khazar wouldn't simply walk away. They had won the game, but that victory was only a small piece of the puzzle. What if the real challenge hadn't even begun yet? What if Khazar had something else in mind? John tried to push those thoughts aside. For now, he needed to focus on getting Emily back home. The journey ahead wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be short. They had made it through the tournament, but that didn't mean the alien world had no more surprises in store for them. As they continued their walk, John felt his tension rising with every step. The strange buildings loomed overhead, their sharp angles and glowing lights casting long shadows on the ground. The streets were filled with people, some human, some alien, but John kept his eyes moving, scanning for anything out of the ordinary. He couldn't afford to be caught off guard again. He felt a sudden chill run down his spine. He stopped, instinctively reaching for Emily's hand. "Stay close," he said in a low voice. Emily, sensing the change in his demeanor, looked up at him, her eyes filled with concern. "What's wrong?" she asked quietly. "Just be ready," John said, his voice tight. He wasn't sure what he was sensing, but something didn't feel right. The silence between them was heavier now, and every corner, every shadow seemed to hide something waiting to strike. As they continued down the street, the crowd seemed to thin out. The bustling sounds of the city faded into the background, and the only thing John could hear was the thudding of his own heart. Then, in the distance, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A group of figures, standing in the shadows, watching them. John couldn't see their faces, but the way they stood, motionless, like predators, made his stomach twist. "Emily, stay close," John said again, this time more urgently. He pulled her behind him, instinctively putting himself between her and the threat. The figures didn't move, but John could feel their eyes on them. He could sense the tension in the air, thick with anticipation. He couldn't make out their faces, but he knew they were watching, waiting for the right moment. John's mind raced. Was it Khazar's people? Had they come to settle the score, to enforce the consequences he had warned about? Or was it someone else? Someone more dangerous? The figures in the distance slowly began to approach, their steps deliberate and unhurried. They weren't in a hurry, but they weren't leaving either. They were closing in. John's pulse quickened. He had to act, and he had to act fast. But he also had to be smart. He couldn't just rush into a fight without knowing what he was up against. He scanned the area, looking for an escape route, a way out. The street was too narrow, and the buildings too high. There was no clear exit, no obvious way to break free. The figures were getting closer now, and John could see more clearly that they were not human. They were tall, with angular features, their skin a pale shade that seemed almost translucent under the glowing lights. They wore dark, tight-fitting uniforms that hid most of their physical traits, but their movements were precise and calculated. John's instincts told him these weren't just random passers-by. These were trained individuals, soldiers, perhaps. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. This wasn't the time to panic. He had to protect Emily, and he couldn't let fear control him. He was human, and as far as he was concerned, that meant he had a better chance of outsmarting these alien forces. "Stay behind me," he whispered to Emily. She nodded, her expression a mix of fear and determination. She was scared, but she trusted him. And that trust gave John the strength he needed. The figures were closing the gap now, just a few paces away. John took another step back, positioning himself between Emily and the approaching strangers. He could feel the tension thickening, the weight of the moment pressing on him. "Who are you?" John demanded, his voice steady but filled with authority. The leader of the group stepped forward, its features now clearer in the dim light. The alien's eyes were an unnaturally bright green, glowing with an almost eerie intensity. It studied John for a moment, as if weighing his worth, before it spoke in a low, gravelly voice. "We are here for the human girl," it said simply. John's heart skipped a beat. The words sent a chill through him, but he didn't let it show. "What do you want with her?" he asked, his tone firm. The alien's lips curled into a slight, almost mocking smile. "That is not your concern." The tension in the air was unbearable. John stood his ground, feeling every muscle in his body tense as the alien's eyes locked onto his. The creature's cold, glowing green gaze seemed to pierce right through him, but John wasn't about to back down. Not now, not when he had come this far to protect Emily. Emily, who was standing behind him, was breathing heavily, her eyes wide with fear. She had no idea who these beings were or what they wanted, but she trusted John. She had to. He had saved her life more times than she could count, and in that moment, she knew he wouldn't let anything happen to her. "Leave her alone," John said again, his voice unwavering. His pulse was racing, but he refused to let the fear take over. He wasn't some helpless bystander. He had survived worse, and he wasn't about to let a group of strange aliens threaten his daughter. The leader of the group, the one who had spoken earlier, took a step forward. Its movements were fluid, almost unnatural, like a predator circling its prey. But John didn't flinch. "You misunderstand," the alien said, its voice low and menacing. "We are not here to harm her. We are here to claim what is ours." John's mind raced as he tried to make sense of the words. "Claim what?" he demanded, his voice rising in frustration. "What are you talking about?" The alien's smile, if it could be called that, grew wider. "She is part of a much larger game. A game you've already lost." John felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Whatever game the alien was referring to, he knew it was something far bigger than he had imagined. This wasn't just about the bet anymore. This was about something else, something that reached beyond their worlds, beyond their understanding. "Why her?" Emily finally spoke, her voice trembling but determined. She stepped out from behind John, her eyes locked onto the alien leader. "What do you want from me?" The alien paused for a moment, its glowing eyes scanning her face as if trying to read her thoughts. It seemed to consider her words carefully before it responded. "You have something that we need," it said, its tone surprisingly calm. "Something your father doesn't understand." John's heart raced. "What do you mean?" "She's just my daughter. There's nothing special about her. She's just—" The alien interrupted him with a wave of its hand. "No, she is more than that. Much more." John's mind was spinning. What could this alien possibly want with Emily? She was just an ordinary human girl, no different from any other. But these aliens seemed convinced that she was the key to something larger, something he couldn't yet comprehend. "Why are you telling us this?" Emily asked, her voice steady despite the fear creeping up inside her. "What do you gain from it?" The alien leader tilted its head slightly, as though amused by her question. "You still don't understand. We don't gain anything. This is not about us. It is about the balance of the universe." John's confusion only deepened. Balance of the universe. What was that supposed to mean? Was this all some cosmic game? Was his daughter truly the key to something far bigger than any of them? Emily turned to John, her eyes filled with a mix of worry and determination. "Dad, I don't know what this is about, but I'm not just going to sit here and let them take me." John's heart swelled with pride at his daughter's courage. She was so much stronger than he ever realized. The words of the alien leader echoed in his mind, but he couldn't afford to be distracted by them. He needed to think. He needed to make the right choice. He looked at the alien group once more, weighing his options. There was no turning back now. If they had come this far, it was clear they weren't going to leave without a fight. John had only one choice: stand and protect his daughter at all costs. "You won't take her," John said, his voice resolute. The alien leader studied him for a moment longer, its eyes narrowing. "You have no idea what you're up against, but very well. If you refuse, then the consequences will be yours to bear." John didn't back down. "I don't care what happens. You'll have to go through me." For a long, tense moment, nothing moved. Then the alien leader raised a hand, signaling to the others behind it. Slowly, they stepped back, their hands resting on their weapons.